Today at the National Press Club, Chief Science and Strategy Officer of Omico, Professor David Thomas, will speak about cancer, the modern plague. He'll address advancements in genomic technology and precision oncology. That's today at the National Press Club. Professor David Thomas.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Press Club of Australia, coming to you from Ngunnawal country and today's Westpac address. And it's a very special address today. My name is Steve Lewis, a long-standing member, or director, I should say, of the NPC, which is celebrating this year its 60th anniversary as the premier institution in Australia for public debate and discourse. Today is Rare Cancer Awareness Day, so it's appropriate that we have one of the world's leading exponents of cancer, someone who has done some amazing work, some amazing research, Professor David Thomas. His credentials in the field of cancer research is arguably unparalleled. He is the Director, Centre for Molecular Oncology at UNSW, the head of the Genomic Cancer Medicine Laboratory at the Garvan Institute, and Chief Science and Strategy Officer of Omico. David, welcome to the National Press Club. His speech entitled Cancer, the Modern Plague. Just before I introduce David, I want to give a shout out to Natasha Robinson from The Australian, who has just been awarded the Health Journalist of the Year. Natasha, apart from being a former colleague of mine, is one of Australia's leading journalists, and she has done some amazing reporting in this field, really important field. Please welcome Professor Thomas.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here today on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I acknowledge the elders and traditional owners of this land and any other Aboriginal people attending or watching today. I'd like to thank the National Press Club of Australia for hosting this event today. It's an honour and a privilege to be here and to be able to speak or give voice to such an important topic, as I hope to be able to share with you. I'd like to thank Christine Coburn and her team at Rare Cancers Australia for the opportunity to address you on Rare Cancers Awareness Day. What perfect timing. I'm delighted to see senators and members of Parliament here, and thank you for your commitment to being here. It's very important that we know that our leaders have the challenges faced by cancer patients in mind. And I'd like especially to acknowledge many people in this audience today who are colleagues and friends who have made significant contributions to the cancer community and to the patients that we all serve. Thank you all for coming and for tuning in on your screens. Today is Rare Cancers Awareness Day. In this very important address, using statistics, of course, because I'm a geek, and my own experiences as a doctor, but also as a patient, I'll show you that rare isn't rare. This is the point that Natasha was making, and the systematic disadvantage that this group has faced historically. I'll share with you the amazing revolution in cancer medicines which is currently underway. And using that other modern plague, COVID-19, I'll show you that through science, rare cancers are now a soluble problem. Our challenge today, affording the successes of science and distributing these equitably, are about innovations in health policy and public discourse, therefore, as much as science. Finally, I'll try to leave my sense of what cancer could look like for the next generation of Australians, with will and vision. Cancer is no question the plague of our time. Since that other modern plague, COVID-19, emerged in 2020, there have been approximately 90 million cancers diagnosed worldwide and almost 40 million deaths. The comparable toll from COVID-19 is a touch over 7 million deaths. In Australia, 1 in 2 people will be diagnosed with cancer during their lifetime, with 150,000 Australians diagnosed every year. In 2024 alone, cancer can be expected to kill 1 Australian every 10 minutes. That's 3 during the course of this talk. That's more than 200,000 Australians who will die this year. With numbers like these, it's not surprising that cancer's taken over the leading cause of death worldwide in higher income countries in 2017 after a 40-year reign by cardiovascular disease. Now, aside from its human toll, its toll on families, COVID-19 has taught us the economic cost to society of failing to manage health effectively. Cancer has a very big economic footprint. We directly spend more than $10 billion each year on cancer. Like COVID-19, cancer is linked to ageing, but unlike COVID-19, cancer is the leading cause of disease-related death in the young. Since the emergence of COVID-19, cancer has killed more than 40,000 working-age Australians. Disturbingly, young onset cancers are on the rise for reasons that we don't understand yet. In 2018, for people diagnosed with cancer at a working age, half of them cannot work, costing an amazing $1.7 billion to Australian gross domestic product. And even for those who are not directly affected, family disruption is absolutely immense, as all of us can testify. To summarise, cancer affects all of us. Almost every person in this room will have a personal experience of cancer, and many of them will come onto the programs that we, as I'll talk about, have provided to try and provide options that don't yet exist in routine practice. But even if you haven't yet personally had cancer, you've cared for someone who has, and if you haven't cared for someone, you have a social stake in the outcomes of cancer. The good news, which I want to share with you, is that cancer is undergoing a once-in-a-century revolution. It's a genetic disease caused by changes, or what we call mutations, in the DNA within each of the 70 trillion cells that make up the average human being. Remarkable advances in genomics, the technologies that read DNA, enable us to map the mutation patterns in human cancers. Let me give you some perspective on this. The last comparable advance in cancer occurred in the middle of the 19th century. The then astonishing advance of the light microscope revealed that cancers were made up of cells that hadn't been appreciated before. The impact of this advance still defines almost everything about the way we manage cancer in society today by using anatomy, breast cancer, and the colourful patterns we see under the light microscope. The limitation of these systems is that they tell us nothing about what makes a cancer tick. Only by understanding cancer at a molecular level can we intelligently design better treatments. And in the past 20 years, the science of genomics has provided us with a molecular microscope, enabling us to move from seeing cancer as a lump, or even as a group of cells, to the level of the individual deranged molecules that become new drug targets. These new drug targets are uniquely present in cancer cells and not present in normal cells. And this in turn allows us for the first time to design drugs that, with exquisite specificity, target those mutations. Since each person's cancer has its own unique DNA fingerprint, you see that on the tables in front of you, each person's unique tumour code is unique. And that allows the era of precision medicine, when doctors can tailor treatments to each patient's individual tumour. That's precision medicine, getting the right drug to the right patient at the right time. This is a very recent phenomenon, which we easily take for granted, and I think many people are perhaps unaware of. One generation ago, we didn't know why drugs worked, except by trial and error. These drugs, which we know as chemotherapies, often cause severe side effects because they also affected normal cells. Chemotherapy trials had to be very large in order to detect a benefit, which probably only applied to a fraction of those that we treated. This in turn meant that drug development focused for the past 50 years on more common cancer types, where the numbers enabled statistical power. Now, please don't get me wrong. As an oncologist, chemotherapies are clearly a major step forward, and they remain important treatments today. In 1970, for reference, fewer than 1 in 4 patients diagnosed with cancer would be alive 5 years later. Today, in Australia, that number is 7 in 10. The issue is that not all patients have equally benefited from the chemotherapy era. Patients with rare cancers have been left behind. Rare cancers simply don't fit the anatomic and light microscope model of cancer. There are more than 185 different histologic, this light microscope classifications, each of which is small but collectively huge. Our own data from Omico's programs underline this point about options for treatment. Over the past 8 years, our programs have provided genomic profiling to thousands of cancer patients who have exhausted standard treatment options with the goal of finding new targeted therapies. Those Australians with rare cancers coming onto our program typically have had half the number of standard treatments as those with common cancers. Now, I specialise in the management of a particularly rare cancer, sarcomas. These are cancers of connective tissues, fat, muscle and other cartilage and other tissues of that kind, and they disproportionately affect the young, especially children. The absence of effective treatments for sarcoma has effectively, over my lifetime, shaped my professional career. I'll tell you one story, but it stands for many. Lucy, which is not her real name, was a 35-year-old mother of 2 young children, under 5, who had a beautiful husband and a great job in the Australian Writers Guild as a communications manager. Life was bright. She then was unlucky enough to get diagnosed with a bone sarcoma. I first saw her clinically in 2015. She received months of intensive chemotherapies which were designed in the 1970s and essentially unchanged 40 years later. We were still using them. And luckily again, Lucy was one of the 30% of patients whose cancer was not cured, and we had very little to offer. I looked everywhere for a clinical trial and couldn't find any for Lucy's cancer. With Rare Cancer Australia's support, the community raised $70,000 to enable her to afford one of the very early immunotherapies, and these gave her a few extra precious months of life with her young family before the cancer ultimately took her life. The lesson I took from that was that philanthropy is not an equitable, let alone a scalable basis for healthcare. But these cancers are rare, right? We should focus on big problems. Rare cancers are a paradox. In 2024 in Australia, rare cancers comprised about, or will comprise, 18,000 diagnoses. Now that ranks number 3 after prostate and breast cancer. We've all heard of breast and prostate cancer. Have we heard of rare cancers? Rare cancers will kill almost 7,000 Australians. In 2024, that ranks at number 2 after lung cancer, and we've all heard about lung cancer. Rare cancers include all childhood cancers and most of the cancers that affect the young. Using COVID-19 as a yardstick again, since 2020, rare cancers have killed as many people as COVID-19, and at a younger age than average. Individually rare cancers take a human life every 45 seconds somewhere on this planet. Rare cancers are a silent tragedy, killing thousands of Australians every year, and one which has historically been systematically excluded from traditional old-fashioned drug development. In that silence, our mates have been left behind. I want this address to give a voice to tens of thousands of Australians affected by rare cancers, and I'm somewhat intimidated by that responsibility. To be brutal, rare cancers have been a tragedy without a solution. That's not a basis for health policy. But now a solution does exist, and that's what I want you to take away, that now is the time, in the past 2 or 3 years, when a solution now exists for us to invest in. And that solution, just as for COVID-19, is science. The tools of genomics, biology, drug design have radically accelerated development of targeted treatments. These treatments are much more effective. How much more effective? 6 times as effective as old-fashioned chemotherapies. As doctors, we see this clearly in clinical trials of new drugs. 20 years ago, when sarcoma patients frequently went to early phase clinical trials, 1 in 20 patients would respond to the treatments, the chemotherapy treatments we were testing. Unsurprisingly, trials used to be regarded as an option of last report, experimentation. Today, an early trial of a new drug matched to the right patient offers a 1 in 3 chance of benefit. That's 6 times as effective in 1 generation, and this will only increase. Living through this change as a young doctor in the 1990s, much of my time was spent managing the side effects of chemotherapies. We had no targeted therapies for any cancer, or virtually none. For my sarcoma patients, since the mid-1970s, our best treatment, our current best treatment for soft tissue sarcomas is the chemotherapy doxorubicin, called the Red Devil for those who have been unfortunate enough to be exposed to it because of its red colour. Now, doxorubicin causes a response in 1 in 5 soft tissue sarcoma patients. I often think that sarcoma patients today face better prospects from participation in an early clinical trial of a matched therapy than our current best standard of care. I firmly believe that clinical trials are vital for cancer patients today and should be our standard of care. The biggest cause of cancer death worldwide is lung cancer, and this is, if you like, a poster child for where we could be headed. 20 years ago, lung cancer had few chemotherapies, all with a low and short-lived benefit and no targeted treatments. Today, half of all patients with non-small cell lung cancer have mutations that predict durable and deep responses to new targeted therapies. The data suggests that lung cancer survival has already improved by 40% between 2001 and 2014 alone, and it's accelerated since then. This is only the beginning. The number of new targeted therapies is projected to double over the next 5 years. But let's be sceptical. Maybe this is just a passing fad. Let me take then the hardest challenge in cancer today, which is pancreatic cancer. It's one of the great challenges for cancer research because it kills about 9 in 10 patients who are diagnosed. If we can solve pancreatic cancer, the 4th highest cause of cancer death, we can solve any cancer. Until recently, only a small fraction of pancreatic cancer patients benefit from targeted therapies, perhaps fewer than 1 in 10. I remember being involved in a trial back in 2010 where we managed to get 1 patient out of roughly 500 that we were screening onto a targeted therapy, and because of the way it was designed, they got the control arm. That's what it was like 10 years ago. In the past 12 months alone, new treatments are being tested which may benefit 50%, half of all pancreas cancer patients. And I'm already hearing promising signals from our clinical networks, both here and internationally, about patients with pancreatic cancer who are responding to these new therapies. I believe we'll see big advances for patients with pancreatic cancer in the next 2 to 3 years. At a Landsat level, Omico and our Sister Zero program in childhood cancer have screened more than 14,000 Australians with incurable cancers, identifying good drug targets in more than 1 in 3 and some form of drug target in 7 in 10. That's up from 1 in 20 a decade ago. When I first started these programs, I would quote patients a 1 in 20 chance of finding something. For the patients with these good drug targets, remember that's 1 in 3, we can double survival where we can access the matched therapies today. And the majority of that benefit has come through clinical trials. So let me make that story real for you. Matt, who's allowed me to share his story, was a 24-year-old engineer in Newcastle when he was diagnosed with an incurable sarcoma in his spine. He had metastases throughout his body. Rapidly running out of options, he travelled to Germany to access clinical trials, since there were none in Australia at that time. Think of the financial impact on Matt and his family alone. He was referred to our program in 2017 and was enrolled into one of our immunotherapy trials. Today, Matt's completely free of cancer, so far as we can tell. That's 7 years later. He's working full-time, paying taxes into the community, and he and his wife are expecting their first child. That's the sort of success that we want to see for, and it's not just the only one, Sarah. It's something that we should aim for all Australian cancer patients. Now, for rare cancer patients, perhaps the most exciting advance of all is the increasing number of these targeted therapies which have pan-tumour activity. Now, what that means is that these drugs appear to work in most cancer types in which they've been tested. Since 2017, when the first pan-cancer therapy was approved by the US Food and Drug Administration, there are now 7 approved targeted therapies which have pan-tumour activity, the latest only a couple of months ago. By 2030, the number of these approved pan-cancer treatments is expected to triple. We estimate that the average response rate for these pan-tumour therapies across all cancer types approaches almost 40%, which you'll remember is twice the response rate to our best standard of care for sarcoma patients. So I might move on. This has profound implications for patients with rare cancers. Because why shouldn't drugs that work across any cancer type work on rare cancers as well? Pan-cancer therapies could be the solution for rare cancers patients today, because they don't depend on the anatomy and they don't depend upon the light microscope, but rather primarily on their molecular features. However, there's always a however. The brilliance of science alone is not enough. Drugs that remain on the shelf are of no use to anyone. Virtually none of these drugs are yet reimbursed in any public healthcare system. Why? Here's the problem, and it's a big one. Currently, healthcare spending is at 10% of GDP in Australia. In all higher income countries, it's rising every year. The Intergenerational Report projects that healthcare spending will reach 16% of GDP in Australia by 2066, which is where it is in the US today. By then, an incredible 23% of the population will be over 65 years of age, while the ratio of taxpayers to retirees will fall from 3.7 to less than 2.7. This is driven by the Titanic and the iceberg of the unmovable demand for health and the irresistible progress of science. It's not going to go away. So sustainable solutions are a major long-term issue for all democratic societies. They have to be a matter of public discourse. To afford the successes of science, we need innovations in health policies that match the innovations of science and medicine, that address sustainability and equity. Because healthcare is so expensive, and to ensure transparency and equity, governments have had to value comparable taxpayer investments through what is called health technology assessment. Designed in the last century, health technology assessment is today in crisis because it was precisely designed for incremental advances in healthcare, one drug at a time, rather than a science-driven revolution that is characteristic of precision oncology. Health technology assessment is ill-equipped to address the broader economic, scientific or social consequences posed by the greatest challenges in medicine today. And most importantly, it takes time. Time that patients with cancer don't have. In Australia today, the average gap between recognition of a new effective and safe therapy and receipt of reimbursed access is 18 months. It is literally true that a patient will read in June of this year from the recent American Society of Clinical Oncology conference the advent of new highly effective treatments for their cancer, but will die waiting for that to become accessible in a reimbursed way. And the fundamental problem is the bigger and more complex the problem and the solutions, the greater the challenge is to pass through HTA. I'll make that real for you again. The simple truth is that we could never have solved the challenge of COVID-19 within 2 years if we had relied on the current routine process of HTA. And understandably now, the Australian government is undertaking a review of HTA to find solutions to these issues. What are these solutions? Well, I think we can learn a lot from COVID-19. Health and the economy appear to be mutually exclusive, right? You open your borders and more people die. You save lives and we shut down the economy. I believe it's arguable that the economic impact of COVID-19 precisely drove the urgency of finding a solution. I think we should examine closely the relationship between the economy and health, which are traditionally siloed in governments and in society. Let's look at the private sector. Almost all new drugs are produced by industry. And it's good news. In 2018, an incredible 840 molecules in drug development were being designed globally, with 91% intelligently designed against a target. Every new drug costs more than $1 billion to develop, and that cost is rising every year. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the largest sectors of the economy on the planet. 15 of the top 50 companies investing in research and development today are pharmaceutical companies. Now, we often don't appreciate this, so I'm going to put this in a language that I think should make you surprised. Apple, that innovative IT company, ranks at number 7 with $11 billion invested every year. The pharmaceutical company Roche alone comes in at 8 with 11 billion Swiss francs. Leaving aside where the money is coming from, the reallocation of even a small fraction of global private sector R&D spend into Australia would have a potentially enormous impact on the size of our health economy, and at the same time provide greater engagement that would enable Australians with cancer to be in the box seat for access to emerging scientific breakthroughs. How does this affect healthcare policy? Well, we can consider 2 extreme approaches in the world today. One is to focus solely on containing this spiralling healthcare costs, what I call the fixed pie model. Excuse the analogy, works for me. A nearby example of this in practice is New Zealand, where health budgets have traditionally been fixed and any new expenditures on drugs have had to come from another worthy existing investment. This zero-sum game has led to the withdrawal of pharmaceutical industry from New Zealand, with only 3 firms having offices there today. Very few countries can afford to lose such a massive component of the economic sector, which only can further shrink the pie. I'll note that 2 days ago, the incoming New Zealand government has committed $604 million to providing a surge forward in access of New Zealanders with cancer to modern drugs. So it speaks to the zeitgeist, if you like, something that's not just occurring in this country, but being recognised worldwide. It's also not widely appreciated that the consequence of that previous strategy is that cancer survival in New Zealand today is where it was in Australia in the 1990s. This is what happens when you put your head in the sand. At the other extreme is privatised healthcare. It's no more appetising, exemplified by the US. Driven by science and human demand, the US does offer remarkable healthcare to those that can afford it. Inevitably, any human needs not satisfied by society will be met by private enterprise. And how can we deny an individual's right to pay for healthcare not available in a public system? But this comes at the expense of equity. National outcomes in the US as a whole are actually also worse than Australia. There are fundamental issues for us here in this room. For Australians, mateship matters. I just don't believe Australians can accept that healthcare should be divided according to the ability to pay. Australians don't leave their mates behind. Equity matters. Ultimately, the lesson of COVID-19 is surely that we cannot afford not to solve a major health problem with the economic and social impact that cancer does. Like COVID-19, I believe healthcare is too important to be left to either the public sector or the private sector alone. The public sector or the private sector alone. Sustainable healthcare innovation will require us to grow the pie. That is, to balance the inevitably rising cost of healthcare with the economic growth from the life sciences as a future mainstream of the smart economy. And perhaps even more importantly, greater efficiencies that come out of public-private partnership can ultimately drive down the costs of drug development for us all. A sustainable model must be based on partnership between all those who have a stake in this game, which is to say, as I made the point earlier, all of us. I learned this very personally when I was diagnosed 2 years ago with metastatic cancer. It's odd being on the receiving end of my own research programs. I'm fortunate, very fortunate, I have nothing to complain about, to be the beneficiary of the amazing advances in treatment over the past 2 decades. But for every second person in this room, the difference between being healthy and being a cancer patient who's got to ask this question is time. It's only time. Right here today in Australia, we're applying good old Australian ingenuity to trying to develop solutions which nowhere in the world has come to at this point. We're trying to sustainably and equitably afford the successes of science. Australian governments have invested in the non-profit programs led by Omico and the Zero Childhood Cancer Program to deliver the power of research, genomics and novel treatments to all Australians from birth to old age, sustainably and equitably. Both Omico and Zero are working hand in hand to develop partnerships with all stakeholders, private and public, wherever possible, bringing together industry, clinical networks and the community. One specific strategy we've been pursuing is to increase the clinical trials of targeted therapies in Australia. Now, Australia has an outstanding reputation in medical research, but I don't know if you're aware that fewer than 1 in 12 cancer patients takes part in trials currently. Imagine if this were to double. Twice as many patients could access breakthrough therapies that aren't yet available, potentially reducing demand on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, but also at the same time doubling R&D global investment in Australia's trial sector, which currently in cancer is $1 billion a year. The associated Silicon Valley effect from bringing these companies to invest in this country will enable onshore commercialisation of the best and brightest medical research coming out of our institutes and universities, rather than going offshore. And it will enable us to retain more of our brightest talent. In New Zealand, one of the saddest things that I saw were people who were closing down their labs to be taking up spectacular posts in the US and in Canada. We can't afford that sort of brain drain in this country. Now, what I've just talked about is not theory. Over the past 8 years, Omico and Zero have given more than 15,000 Australian cancer patients treatment options they would otherwise never have had. They've ensured that cancer patients from the bush have exactly the same access to these amazing technologies. And just to give an example there, currently our programs are enrolling 33% of our patients from regional Australia, where the population distribution is about 25%, and I'm very proud about that. 15 of our 51 cancer centres in our network are in regional Australia. That's incredibly important to our program to ensure that people from the bush don't get left behind. Over the last 12 months alone, we've created almost 1,000 new jobs. We're supporting more than 53 clinical trials, 10 of which we're told would never have come into this country unless this infrastructure existed. How are you going to bring a trial of a targeted therapy into a country where we don't have the molecular screening to find out which patients to be testing these treatments on? These trials alone will inject an estimated $130 million into the economy. Now, our vision is to make Australia a preferred global destination for the life sciences industry. Australia's in the Goldilocks zone. It's not too large, it's not too small, it's just right. It can be innovative at a national scale in ways that may be challenging to larger countries, while small changes in global R&D spend have a massive impact on our economy, thereby growing the pie. It seems obvious. What can the next generation expect? Since 1970, cancer survival has already almost tripled. Progress is now accelerating, with an explosion of targeted cancer therapies, astonishing advances in immunotherapies, cellular therapies, and even the vaccine-based therapies that have emerged from COVID-19, reinforcing the message that there are lessons here to be learnt from the other modern plagues we deal with. These approaches have begun where they must, with incurable disease, but they're going to be rapidly translated into the earlier setting so we can increase cure rates. And in addition to the generation of new drugs, we'll be combining those drugs in ways that will also increase survival. And it will not simply be about drugs. A better understanding of individual risk will lead to more personalised and effective risk management, catching cancers before they've had a chance to spread. There are 250,000 survivors, I'm looking at Peter from Canteen down here, of early onset cancers in Australia today. We'll be developing the wellness strategies that have had such a huge impact on cardiovascular disease mortality. Science has come of age when it can be called on by society to solve crises today, like COVID-19. Science has now developed solutions to the modern plague of cancer. What could we achieve, I ask, if we decided to tackle the modern plague of cancer with the urgency and focus that we tackled COVID-19? Taken together, I believe we can halve cancer mortality in the next generation. That's 25,000 lives each year. Imagine saving as many lives each year as we lost to COVID-19 in total, and while growing the economy and strengthening the value for money that our society expects. Cancer will no longer be a death sentence. It'll become a disease which we can live and even thrive with. The theory's proven. The solutions currently exist. It's now time to implement them. Let's leave no one behind. And before you say anything else, I just want to dedicate this to Kate Vines and Richard, who have been trying to tell us all of this for many years now. Thank you to you both.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor David Thomas, for that speech. Incredible speech. Some very alarming statistics in there, and some words, silent tragedy, etc. So we're here in Canberra where decisions are taken on how the Commonwealth budget is divvied up. We're going to spend $368 billion potentially on nuclear subs. And the NDIS, which wasn't a thing just a few years ago, is going to cost $43 billion this year. And I don't know the forecast, but it's going to balloon well above that. So is there a risk that these sorts of programs and others are actually cannibalising the spend that's required to eradicate or reduce rare cancers? Is it a case that this silent tragedy needs a voice, otherwise we are going to be left behind? Are there any quick fix solutions?
No, well, there's never any quick fix solutions, and I'm reluctant to engage in a comparison with other worthy causes of investment. It's not my job to criticise decisions taken by the government. All I think that we have to do, Steve, is make the case. We've got to make a case, and we need to not just think about it from a self-interested perspective. That's the view that I've taken over the past 3 or 4 years through Omico, is that, sure, you can take a patient-centred focus and think about what it means for individual patients, even at the national level. That should all be true. But we also have to think about what are the challenges faced by us as a society, because it affects all of us, and that includes how much money we pay in taxes and where those taxes get distributed. I think we have to come up with ways of finding solutions for government, give them an investable proposition. And the people in this room, from industry through to the community in general, through to our academic colleagues and clinicians, all of them have a role to play in putting that case in a coordinated way to government. That's been the incredible thing about Omico's programs, that we've established these public-private partnerships that enable us to double or triple the yield on whatever government gives us. And it's that sort of message that I want to send to government. You can do this. You can do this today. You can save lives. You can strengthen health technology assessment, and you can grow the economy. And if you do all of those things, you're not taking any money from anybody else or any other worthy cause.
Thank you. We're very fortunate today to have a extraordinary lineup of health journalists from around Australia. And we're going to start with one of the very best, Sue Dunleavy.
Sue Dunleavy from News Corp. You've spoken today about the inequity of funding and the fact that many of these treatments are not actually funded by our medicine subsidy scheme. It puts you as a doctor in a very difficult position when you've got a patient you think could benefit from one of these treatments. Can you talk us through how you make a decision about whether you even raise the conversation with the person who might have to fund this medicine privately? What sort of, how do you make the decision which patients to talk about this with, and how do you also cope with the problem that, as you've said in your own statistics, 2 in 3 people may not actually get a result from a very expensive treatment? They may have to access their superannuation, rely on money from friends or family, or even sell their house. How difficult a decision is that, and what are the sorts of things that you prioritise when you're making that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's why I told the story of Lucy, because back in 2015, that was the situation for Lucy. It was, she's too young. She's just too young, and the emerging therapies have perhaps lower evidence of benefit, but what is called the Bayesian prior of biology, what I call the Bayesian prior, just to explain what I mean by that, the whole advance in the way that we think about designing treatments has given us this 6-fold better prospects of benefit for new therapies. And so the idea that one might want to put somebody on a clinical trial, even if it's unproven, because it might prove beneficial to the patient taking part, is where I wanted to head initially. And that's why we invested in these programs. We set up the programs through Omico and through the molecular screening and therapeutic studies that we've been running, precisely to give more patients options that they didn't have to pay for, whilst generating evidence that would also assist in understanding where the opportunities were at a larger scale. So trying to increase clinical trials is one part of that solution. And so in the meantime, what you do for individual patients, you hunt and look as hard as you can for options to access treatments. You sometimes go to the pharmaceutical industry, which I don't know if people are aware, but they provide compassionate access to thousands of Australians when currently treatments may not be accessible, but where there's evidence of benefit. So there are different models, but all of them lack a feeling of systematisation. There's another element to this, which is of equity about this, which I find very poignant, which is, imagine being a rare cancer patient and you've paid your taxes to society, including taxes that get spent on healthcare, and you get a cancer type which is just never going to find its way through the regulatory process and get approved. I think that inequity is another part of the puzzle here. If we can provide an investable solution, natural justice suggests that if we have an investable solution, that money could then go to paying for their own care rather than paying for other people's care, and doing so systematically rather than accidentally. I think ultimately the high costs of treatments have to be addressed by increased efficiency. Drug development is incredibly expensive. It is being done in partnership with the private sector. We have to support and work with the private sector. I'll give one example that's on my mind at the moment. So these pan-cancer therapies, they've been around for about 6 or 7 years. I think they're incredibly important for rare cancer patients. But there's a potential for industry to simply stop engaging in that idea because it can't find a way through the regulatory process to get reimbursed in one of the 85 countries that depend upon health technology assessment. If we can find a solution, it's not only going to be a solution for us, it's going to be a solution globally for companies, and incentivize them to tackle this area proactively. Because the size of the problem is as large as for lung cancer. Imagine if industry said, now we can tackle rare cancers in the same way that we prioritize lung cancer or breast cancer or prostate cancer. That's the goal. And I think, I haven't gone into all the detail because it's too much for this particular forum, but there are many, many ways that we could work together to increase efficiencies and drive down the costs and increase the access of patients to these treatments.
Next question from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. You talked about treatment, research and funding.
Yes.
I've got a question about diagnosis.
Yes.
I think it's a general truth that early diagnosis of cancer is a boon.
Yes.
But I figure that diagnosis of rare cancers is probably slow, because GPs and even specialists may not be fully attuned to what's going on. Am I right? And are there measures or any tactics that could fast forward the diagnosis of rare cancer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I didn't talk about it because I was trying to talk about sustainability models through public-private partnerships. But the public sector has an enormous investment. I think it's something like over $200 million a year spent on screening programs like breast screen and cervical screening, all of which are just blunt instruments. Everyone at the age of 50, every 2 years, gets screened for using mammography. But we know genetically that some women are much less likely to get cancer diagnosis, and some have a much higher chance of getting a breast cancer diagnosis. Surely in the future we'll be testing people, working out what their risk is, and then tailoring our screening strategies to pick up those things early. There's a particular aspect, though, that you touched on, which is late diagnosis for rare. And that's a particular issue for cancers in the young. As I said, a lot of these diseases are actually more common in the young. Childhood cancer, for example. And there you can understand a GP seeing a child come in with a sore hip isn't going to think that it's an osteosarcoma of the hip. They're going to think that it's growing pains. That's typically what we hear, growing pains. Or a lump, which, because a GP might see one sarcoma in a lifetime, doesn't cause sarcoma to be at the top of the list. And that inevitably results in some delays. So there is a communication strategy involved here. I think, generally speaking, the concept of precision medicine could be adapted to getting the right screening process to the right patient at the right time. And that's about understanding at a population level what genomics can tell us about variable cancer risk. In this room, people will have a very high risk of cancer, people will have a much lower risk of getting cancer. Maybe they're more likely to get cardiovascular disease. Surely we should be developing wellness and prevention programs that will allow us to intervene earlier at a curable stage. And I think that's going to be part of the future. I think there are also emerging tests, like the multi-cancer early detection test I'm sure that you guys have written about before. These are very promising, because a blood test for cancer could be like the cholesterol test for cardiovascular disease. Managing risk is how we're really going to knock cancer off its perch, I think. So I think your question's very accurate.
Is there a role there for AI? I don't think you referred to AI, but in terms of further to Simon's question and your response, I mean, should we be using AI more to screen all sorts of cancer, and would that free up money towards rare cancers potentially?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, isn't it? So what Steve might be referring to in part is the use of AI, which is quite mature in imaging. So when you get an X-ray, currently there are Australian companies actually, which have developed software packages that will be able to pre-screen the X-ray so as to save the radiologist time. Imagine if you're short on radiologists to be able to look at thousands of X-rays that you're performing, and you could put it through a software package that would say, flag this one, ignore the rest. That would be a good way that you could apply AI. But there's another element to this which is really interesting, which is we're generating more and more and more data. And the data gets to a point where, as a biologist, as a clinician, I can't intuitively see into it anymore. Intuition no longer works. And that's where AI can pick up patterns potentially that we can't. So part of what we're trying to do in our programs is to generate a real-world data set, an evidence-based system where we learn from as many patients as possible. And for rare cancer patients, that's particularly important because any rare cancer patient we don't put into that database is an opportunity lost to be able to help the next patient. So a self-learning system is something that is incredibly important to realising the maximum value from this in general. And the AI will, of course, be deployed on that data set.
Thank you. Natasha Robinson.
Hi, David. I'm just really interested in the points you raise about the MSAC process and the HTA assessment.
Yes.
And the point you made about the need to bring together the economic case with the health case. And it just seems on the face of it that if you put those two things together, it's a no-brainer that it is expensive to put the money into these treatments, but the payback that you get in terms of actually being able to cure cancer, and that's no exaggeration, and, you know, for people to actually live a life and contribute to society in all sorts of ways, including, you know, paying taxes to the government, is a no-brainer on the face of the figures.
Yes.
As you would imagine them to be. Why is it that that is not obvious to our committees that are making these decisions? And do you have any faith that this technology assessment process will actually amend that situation?
Natasha, you're right at the cutting edge of this stuff, and so it really does seem to you and I that it is obvious. 10 years ago, I was quoting a 1 in 20 chance of benefit. It's changed very rapidly. And healthcare systems are unfortunately designed to be inert. To the extent that I'm creative as an oncologist in my clinical practice is the extent to which I'll wind up in the law courts. We're designing a system that's designed to follow cookbooks. It's only when the cookbooks run out that we need to improvise. And that's unfortunately, that evidentiary base in that grey zone is a difficult area to invest in. So let me defend HTA, because I believe in value for money. I don't think any of us here don't believe in value for money. The issue is that the processes that have been established have allowed a fairly equitable, standardised way of saying, okay, this new treatment has a benefit and it costs us $20,000 for every quality adjusted life year gained. Excuse me for the technology, but that's the language that they use. And that's as good as we've currently approved for melanoma, so let's do it. That's the sort of purpose of equity and transparency of use of taxpayer dollars. The problem is that it doesn't work where the ramifications of a radical change affect almost every aspect of care. And somebody touched upon diagnosis a moment ago. There's an element of diagnosis here. So when we apply these technologies, we change the diagnosis of the patient that's been referred onto our programs in about 1 in 20 individuals. That's standard of care treatment. Just change the diagnosis because you have a more accurate identification of where the cancer actually began. So how do you calculate that into your ISAs? What's the gain that you get out of more accurate diagnosis? Can you quantify the benefits from standard of care therapies that are more appropriately defined? At the other extreme, I've talked about increasing the size of the pie. One of the things we're trying to do with Prospect in the program running now is we're trying to capture the economic gain so we can go not to health, but to the cabinet table with Treasury and Finance and have a conversation about where the money comes from and could be preserved to be able to afford some of these sort of potential areas of expenditure. I think there's a lot of interest within the department to be looking at this, and you know that because of the HTA review, but I've talked to people within the department or just emerged from the department, people like Andrew Wilson, and then they're not against the ideas that we're putting forward. But it's our collective responsibility, but particularly I feel it as an intense personal responsibility to put forward something that addresses their concerns, not just the concerns as I might see it as a doctor or as a patient. So I think what we'll have to do, though, is do what we do in experimental science, and that is to experiment with a system in the same way they've experimented in trials or in the laboratory. We need to create a space where we test what happens if we tweak those levers and see whether it actually is true that we can stimulate the economy and increase the number of patients who get treated, improve their survival, and solve everything simultaneously. And I think that's what we need. We need something between old standard of care and PBS standard of care that allows early access to treatment, while at the same time demanding that we generate the data that societies need to know whether they're putting good money to good use. And it's complicated. But that's our job. We should be able to come up with a complicated argument between all of us. We should be able to come up with an argument that does satisfy everybody. I firmly believe that's true.
Thank you. Our next question is from Laura Banks.
Laura Banks, the Sydney Morning Herald. You touched on data and the Prospect program, which I'm not sure people here may not be aware, but it's the mapping of each patient's genomic data to individually tailor solutions for their rare cancer. Over the next decade, the biodata that you're going to render from this program is remarkable, something like 70,000 profiles. Does that realistically mean that we are looking at eradicating rare cancers?
I think what will happen is that common cancers will become rare. So think about lung cancer. It's 8,000 deaths a year, a big single entity. If you're doing a trial for all lung cancer patients, there's lots of patients to go for. But trials and science have identified that subgroups within lung cancer have a particular mutational target. We don't use that mutational definition routinely in clinical practice across all cancers. We do for some, but it's just an emerging field. I think when you start to integrate the molecular data upon the light microscope data, what you'll see is that everything amounts to some 50, 100, 200 people. So that what that will happen is to democratise the concept of rare. I think what rare will become is more on an even playing field. And that's why it's so important that we solve this problem. Because it's not as if science is not pushing us in that direction anyway. We need to develop ways of evaluating that as a society, as well as we're currently doing in clinical trials today. Do I think it'll eradicate rare cancers? I think cancers are a fundamental design fault. We start off with one cell, we live for 70 years. Every time a cell divides, and remember we're made up of 70 trillion cells, that's lots of cell divisions, there's going to be an error that's introduced. You can see it in our faces. You can tell that I'm not 20. That's the phenotypic correlate of my genome in different cells. And those changes that are randomly accumulating in our body are what generates cancer. We just weren't designed, we could never have been designed perfectly. And there's a complex evolutionary theory behind all of that. But I think what we can do is acknowledging that those cancers are going to start up. We can get there early, cure them surgically if possible, and the combination of therapies, the immunotherapies in particular, but the combinations of therapies are going to enable us potentially to cure even cancers which have spread. And we're beginning to see that. Doctors are terrified of the C word with advanced cancer, but I think many of us believe that when you harness the immune system in particular, it is possible to get the immune system to get rid of the cancer permanently after you finish giving the drugs. So all of that will happen over the next few years, and it may not eradicate rare cancers, but it might turn them from being a death sentence, as I said, to something that is just like being diagnosed with, a mole. It could be just a part of who we are.
And you're giving people hope.
Well, science, that's science's job. Science is evidence-driven hope. It's not just saying, let's wish, close our eyes and wish. It's all about trying to look to a future that will be better. And in my experience, cancer patients that I've looked after over the past 3 decades, many of them are quite realistic about where they are. I understand that myself quite clearly. We don't expect miracles, but we do expect us to care enough to try and make things potentially a little bit better. And many people are actually interested in thinking that something might be better for the people to come as much as they are for themselves. And that's the spirit that we should try to echo as a society, I think, in the way that we implement research into clinical practice.
Thank you for the work you do.
That's a pleasure.
I should remind you, David, that 30 is the new 20. I tell myself that every day. And I should also acknowledge that Laura Banks and our next questionnaire, Robin Riley, were also both recognised in the Health Journalism Awards. They were, in fact, category winners. Yep. And Robin Riley, over to you.
Thank you. Robin Riley, Herald Sun. My question is around clinical trials. I love writing about them because you're writing about hope, which is what you were just saying earlier. But my question is, when is too soon to be talking about something that may be a phase 1 clinical trial and potentially a treatment 5 or 10 years away? Do we risk reader fatigue if we're talking about some of these discoveries too soon?
No, is the short answer, Robin. 8% of patients going on to clinical trials, when 30% of people dying from cancer, I don't believe any patient should die without taking part in a trial of the suite of just incredible treatments that are on the horizon. Pancreatic cancer, for example. There's been such fatalism about pancreatic cancer. You know, why bother? It hasn't. Survival is 5%, it increased to 12%, I think, most recently after 30 years of effort. Just nothing is ever going to work. Well, right now is the message I'm trying to send. You guys need to send the message that these trials are coming through, they're showing early signs of promise, they're reasonable questions to ask, and if you've got pancreatic cancer that's incurable, don't despair, get yourself molecularly profiled, try to get onto these trials. Not only does it help with the trials, so the trials get answered more quickly, so we can move on if it's not successful, or we can drive it forward if it is successful, it's good for the patients today. And that's what the point I was trying to make about six-fold improvement in survival is, if it was 1 in 20, then sure, science is experimenting on us, you know, we're giving but we're not necessarily receiving, this is about a future 10 years away. But when it's 1 in 3, that changes, doesn't it? And it doesn't mean that you put everybody onto the same trial, but if you're doing the molecular profiling and you've got that target, it's a 1 in 3 chance that you'll get a response, even in phase 1. Even in phase 1, before it's been proven. As it goes through, of course, the chance of it benefiting is rising and rising and rising. You still need to do that trial process to get the sort of convincing evidence that it should become standard of care. But actually, I think clinical trials are a really important part. So let me just give you some numbers. The way I think about rare cancers as a pie chart is that there are 1/3 of patients who've got incurable disease today that we don't have a drug for. There's another third where there's some very interesting ideas, very early stage, maybe based around Petri dish type experiments or maybe just anecdotal reports. The benefit there is, you know, perhaps 10% improvement in survival. Then the remainder, which is 40% or thereabouts, we can double survival or better with trials today. We know that because our own data shows that we've doubled the survival of patients in that 40% group. And of that 40%, perhaps 22% still need clinical trials to get that proof that we ultimately need to make it standard of care. And the other 15% or so are FDA approved already and should be standard of care. So what we've been doing over the past decade is to try and increase the number of trials because we get that 22% that is an important option. What we need to do going forward is to find a way to complete the loop and get them as part of standard of care. And that's about recognising the importance of how we rethink health technology assessment so that governments can invest safely in that space. So, but if we were just left with those without trials, I'm missing 22% of patients that I want to be putting onto those treatments. So I passionately believe trials are important.
I do too.
Yeah, no, good on you, Robin. Tell the message, send the message.
Our next questionnaire is Sophia McCorgan from AAP. And I believe this is your first question at the National Press Club.
Yes, it is. I'm a cadet journalist with Australian Associated Press, and just for clarification, it's Sophia McCaffin. It is a bit of a tricky Irish last name. But my question, Professor, for you today surrounds genomic profiling. Now, I would say genomic profiling could be described in a sense as preventative healthcare. Why, in your opinion, hasn't the government or the healthcare industry as a whole taken advantage of this possible life-saving diagnostic tool?
I think it's got to do with uncertainty. And I think the department would agree. That's the central word that's part of the health technology assessment review, that there's such uncertainty. Think about it this way. You do a whole genome sequence on somebody. That's 3 billion letters of code that you can read. Some of that stuff is still mysterious to us. We don't know what it means. Some of it is clearly, we have a BRCA1 mutation. We know to put that person onto a risk reduction program for breast cancer, for example. But there's a grey zone of uncertainty where there is considerable debate about what should be actioned, so to speak, or what should be ignored. And it's that grey zone that health systems struggle with. That's why I'm saying that I think research ought to be incorporated into clinical practice at the system level. There's got to be a space, clinics where patients can come when the cookbook, that actionable stuff, runs out, and you have to rely upon asking the question with an open mind, knowing that the outcomes are uncertain, but knowing also that by doing that, you're participating in answering those questions for future patients and potentially for yourself. That's a question about genomics for risk and prevention. There's also an element of this for treatment, which is what we've been talking about, as opposed to prevention. And there the thing is really interesting. This is where HTA comes in, right? So there's a drug, a couple of drugs that target NTRK, which is a mutation in a gene. It's extremely rare. It's about 0.1% of all cancers. And a Dutch assessment rejected these drugs, even though they had a 75% objective response rate. That's fantastic response rate, because it costs $2.3 million to find every patient paying for the profiling. So it might seem it's insoluble. How are you going to, you get killed with the costs of screening. The answer there is obvious though. Now that we've got 15% of patients, not 0.1% that have actionable drugs, all that one test can identify patients for all of that 15% of treatments. And all of a sudden you're not getting a 0.1% hit rate, you're getting a 1 in 6 response rate, hit rate. And then the cost for screening to identify each patient drops as a function of the costs you're paying for treatments. And we've only just got to that point. So we've only got to the point where we could think about bundling together treatments in our health technology assessment to be able to generate the same metrics that we've used for single treatments previously. And I think that's where the adventure needs to go next. We need to do that in a way that generates data, confirms whether that's true, and if it is true, just from our own analysis, I'm here to tell you that I think that the ISA per quality will be half of what is acceptable as a minimum value for a good proposition for investment. We just have to think differently and be brave enough to generate the data to confirm that.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate it.
No worries.
Thank you, Sophia McCaffin. With Irish lineage, I've got a feeling you've got a bright future in journalism. Don't know why. I don't know why. David, we've got time for one final question. I think we might be making history as well, because Alice Klein has got a cadet journalist as well on her hip. Alice Klein from New Scientist, and I should also acknowledge Alice was also recognised in the Health Journal.
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for putting up with the little baby dragon noises. I've got a question a little bit about the prevention stuff you've been talking about.
Yes.
A few years ago, I actually interviewed you about some research you were doing on people with mutations in a TP53 gene.
Yes, yes.
Who I believe you said at the time have a 50% chance of getting cancer by the age of 30.
That's right, Alice. Well done.
And you've been able to put forward a prevention program for them where they have screening tests every year and things like that. I was wondering if you see in the future we might all have our genome sequence identify exactly what cancers we might be at risk for, so then we could have sort of screening tests, personalised screening tests as well.
That's absolutely it, isn't it? So what Alice is referring to is what's called Lee-Fraumeni syndrome, which is caused by mutations in the gene P53, 50% cancer risk by age 30, known about since 1990, but it wasn't until the studies that we and others participated in the mid-2017 is when we published those papers, that we had an intervention. And this is a really important message. Science without the ability to intervene is of no use to patients. It's as bad as having drugs on the shelf. In that study in 2017, we showed that whole body MRI scans can pick up cancers in 1 in 7 to 1 in 14, 1 in 7 children to 1 in 14 individuals who've got Li-Fraumeni syndrome. And for the first time, that became actionable. And so that got incorporated into guidelines since 2017 and became an MBS item as of March last year, thanks to the progress of science. There may be a future, though. So this is rare, right? It's something like, well, it's 1 in 20,000 to 1 in 5,000 individuals who carry these mutations, so relatively small. But like rare cancers, the number of those syndromes is large and growing. For example, in our programs of advanced cancer patients, about 1 in 12 will have a germline risk mutation that we identify through the tumour profiling that could affect their first-degree relatives who may be carrying that mutation and not yet have a cancer that's spread. And I think those sorts of programs will give us an opportunity to identify those patients, and then it's incumbent on people like us to be doing trials of ways to improve their options. And that's why I think the discovery side of genomics needs to be balanced by interventions through clinical trials to improve outcomes. And there is one other sort of element to this which I think is super cool. What you're talking about there is not prevention, that's early detection. But
MRI.
Preventing death, that's certainly true. But imagine if you could prevent the cancer. A drug, like a cholesterol tablet or like a blood pressure tablet for cardiovascular disease, but for cancer. And there are drugs that are emerging that are being tested in advanced cancers. Some of those drugs might migrate all the way up to the point where somebody at risk of cancer might take a medication that might stop the cancers from growing in the first place. That's completely credible. I can imagine certain trials today. I think we need to see a kind of foundation piece for precision oncology being part of mainstream, and I think those trials will come, and hopefully then you'll actually decrease the cancer diagnoses as well as picking them up at an earlier stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note. David Thomas, thank you so much for today's speech, for today's address, for taking those wonderful questions. I think we have made history today, but it's the first time we've had 2 of our journalists asking questions with babies, so that's I think that's a National Press Club record. It's also my grandson Jimmy's 3rd birthday. Couldn't resist. Could you all please thank David Thomas? Thank you.